This is a copy of the Bible study notes on a series on the 7 words of Jesus, featuring the 7 things Jesus said when he was dying on the cross. I'm going to read John chapter 19, verses 24 to 30. So they, the soldiers, said to one another, "Let us not tear it, Jesus' clothes, but cast lots to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. Then when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus' ability to speak on the cross was severely limited. To breathe in and to breathe out caused excruciating pain. Inhaling deep enough to speak words that were loud enough to be heard would only add to Jesus' suffering. Jesus invested that extra effort to speak these words, presumably because he considered these 7 words, these 7 sentences, of great importance. For example, some Jesus' second last words include the words, "It is finished." Jesus was stressing the centrality of the cross to our salvation, an issue of seismic importance. The words we hear Jesus speak in these verses are no less important. Behold your mother. Behold your son. The word behold is only ever used to draw our attention to something huge. The word behold is used to describe the angelic visitors announcing Jesus' birth to Joseph. The word behold is used to describe the cosmic events of the Star of Bethlehem resting above the site of Jesus' birth. Behold, the star came to rest over the place where the child was. The word behold is used when the voice of God speaks audibly at Jesus' baptism. And behold, a voice came from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son." The word behold is only ever used to draw our attention to something absolutely huge. And in the same way, the issue Jesus speaks of here are of huge importance. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." Jesus saw it as of huge importance to know that his family was cared for after his death. Family was a big thing to Jesus. You might have noticed when I was reading those Bible verses before that that 2 times it says that Jesus fulfilled Scripture. The soldiers took his garments and divided them into 4 parts. This was to fulfill the Scripture. Verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the Scripture, "I thirst." Scripture was very clear about Jesus' specific calling. The Messiah was to suffer, thus fulfilling Scripture, fulfilling God's plan. The Messiah was to suffer to save mankind. But Scripture is also very clear about the general calling of Jesus to his mother. Honour your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Jesus didn't just see it as his mission to die on the cross to save mankind. He saw it as his mission to care for his mother after his death. As Paul writes in the book of Timothy, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. In imparting the care of his mother to John, Jesus was fulfilling his duty as a son. The Bible doesn't elevate specific callings, such as the calling to be an apostle or elder. It doesn't elevate these callings to the category of superior importance. And neither does the Bible demote the everyday care of family members to the category of small importance, inferior to the real ministries of calling or callings otherwise involved in daily church life. Instead, a child's duty to their parents, a husband's duty to their wife, a sibling's responsibility to his brother or sister, a mother's calling to raise her children, all of these the Bible describes as high callings, of significance, of importance. Our commitment to these duties, therefore, is to be very high as well. This is even more important. We recognize the importance of our role as family members in today's society. In the Old Testament, a brother-in-law had a duty to care for his sister-in-law if her husband died. But today, her care would be part covered by a life insurance policy and by the welfare state. The primary people for educating children in the Old Testament were their parents. Today we have schools and Sunday school leaders to do the education. Widows and orphans were used to be cared for within the believing community. Today, social workers organize the care of vulnerable groups of people. The New Testament calls husbands to love their wives, but today we can pay the local spa to make her feel special, whilst we go off and enjoy a day of golf. Now, it's obviously great that these other organisations also share biblical priorities to care and educate. But we need to be careful that we don't neglect our responsibilities as family members, thinking that maybe somebody else will do it for us instead. Jesus certainly took his responsibility towards his blood relations seriously. Yet Jesus does not pass on the responsibility to care for his mother, didn't pass on the responsibility to care for his mother to a blood relation. The Gospels tell us that Jesus had other brothers and sisters, and yet Jesus directs his words to care for his mother to John. Why? Why would Jesus have chosen John? Well, I used to have a boss who decided who to pass a job on to using this principle. She'd be stood there and see that something needed doing, or she'd be told that something needed doing, and if you were stood next to her at the time, the job was yours. Ah, Matthew, I've a wonderful opportunity that I think you'd be perfect for, which actually meant the job's yours for no other reason that you're the first person I've seen. I found myself asking the question, did Jesus select John to care for his mum for similar reasons? When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said, "Behold, your mother." Was Jesus' selection of John random? Or was Jesus following the following biblical principle? One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. My guess is that John was not just randomly stood next to Mary at this time. John was likely stood next to her because he knew how painful a time this must have been. John already cared for Mary enough to stand next to her during her darkest hour. John had already put himself in a position to help. John had already demonstrated that he saw care as part of his Christian responsibility. And so, after seeing John demonstrate faithfulness in the small things, Jesus entrusted him with more. In much the same way, if we spend a little time with another believer, we might find that God gives us more ways to be of help to them. If we show we care enough to listen when they talk about everyday things, we might find that we're the one they go to when they have bigger issues that they want to offload. If we show that we care about the things that God cares about, God might entrust our hands with the things that He cares about. So think, where might you start being Jesus' hands and feet? Which person needs a bit more attention? Who is at risk of being overlooked in the church family? What little thing could you do to show that you care? Everybody assumes somebody else is doing it, but no one actually does. What little job needs doing that you could attempt to help with? That practical thing that just requires someone willing, not expertise. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is dishonest in much. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Parcel delivery people and postmen, they handle letters and parcels for a job. The care that they show can be variable. Tossing fragile parcels over the fence, forcing large envelopes through the letterbox, abandoning valuable parcels on the doorstep in the rain. I imagine that, if they saw their home address on the parcel, they'd handle the item differently, gentler, and with much greater care and concern. The home address creates a personal tie between them and the thing in their hand. In much the same way, every believer around us has the same home address as us printed on their forehead. They are a member of God's kingdom, and that makes them family. Therefore, Paul writes, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. As a result of our personal tie, as brothers and sisters, as God's children, as a result of this personal tie, we are to treat Christians as brothers and sisters, and treat them with gentleness and even more care and concern than we normally would. I've got a scattergun of Bible verses which emphasize this point. In the book of Acts, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know that the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. In the book of Matthew, this then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, give us today our daily bread. 1 Peter, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison. And in Corinthians, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honoured, every part rejoices with it. And thirdly and lastly, food and drink are one way that we show love to our family members. Mary had shown Jesus love since birth by feeding him and by hydrating him. But now her hands and feet were incapable of even answering her son's thirst. She stood before the cross of Jesus, helpless to do anything to ease or relieve his pain. And what must it have been like for Jesus watching his mum suffer in that way? He didn't have the words to comfort her, and his hands and feet were nailed to the cross. He was unable to give her a hug or a comforting hand on the shoulder. Watching somebody suffer and being helpless to do anything about it just adds to the pain. Maybe this had something to do with Jesus' words. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." It's as if Jesus was saying to John, "In my absence, be my hands and be my feet." And in the absence of Jesus on this earth, we are to be his hands and his feet to our Christian brothers and sisters. If you read about the work of Open Doors and Barnabas Aid, those on the receiving end of help often remark how somebody else praying with them reminded that God was with them. They often speak of how the aid that they received felt like a tangible demonstration of God's love toward them. In the absence of Jesus on earth, one way he communicates his love and encouragement is through the hands and feet of his people. As Paul writes in the book of Corinthians, "But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus." Paul received the comfort of God through the hands and feet of someone else. Let us go and do the same.